Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up an editorial from page number 6. This column carries out an evaluation of the possible inclusion of Australia under the Malabar naval exercises. See, we have discussed in previous sessions that India is considering the possibility of including Australia under the Malabar naval exercise, which as of now just happens to be a trilateral naval exercise involving India, United States and Japan. This trilateral naval exercise is supposed to be elevated to a quadrilateral naval exercise with the proposed inclusion of Australia. Over the last few months, Australia has been requesting India, which is the principal host of the Malabar exercise, to consider its inclusion. If India agrees to this request from Australia, then it would bring together 4 like-minded democratic countries under one maritime exercise. And this would be the first time since 2007 that the member countries of the Quad would be participating in a joint military exercise together. See, the Malabar exercise dates back to the 1990s, when it just used to be a bilateral naval exercise between India and the United States. Later, between 2005 and 2007, India tried to elevate the bilateral exercise into a multilateral exercise by inviting Japan, Australia and even Singapore. But the participation of these 5 countries in a joint naval exercise in the Indian Ocean was opposed by China because it saw the grouping as a threat to its interests in the Indo-Pacific region. As a result of opposition from China, India terminated the multilateral nature of the Malabar exercise and returned it to the bilateral format involving just India and the US. But due to growing strategic partnership between India and Japan, India brought in Japan as a permanent member in 2015, and since then, the Malabar exercise has become a trilateral naval exercise. Then over the last few years, even Australia, which has similar interests in the Indo-Pacific region, has been requesting India for its inclusion under the Malabar exercise. Then parallel to the Malabar naval exercise, an informal strategic grouping known as the Quad or the Quadrilateral was proposed by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007. The objectives of both the proposed quadrilateral grouping and the Malabar naval exercise complement each other, and both are focused upon promoting maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region and on enforcing a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region that respects and upholds international law. So since the objectives of the Quad and the Malabar naval exercise clash with the interests of China, China sees the proposed Quad as the Asian version of NATO. China perceives the quadrilateral as a security and military grouping led by the United States that is seeking to contain its influence in the Indo-Pacific region. So in this context, the writer carries out a cost-benefit analysis for India if it decides to include Australia under the Malabar exercise, and if it decides to elevate the Malabar exercise into the military arm of the quadrilateral. See, carrying out such a cost-benefit analysis is absolutely essential for India, considering the opposition that China has shown towards the Malabar exercise and towards the quadrilateral grouping. See, India's military partnership with the United States, Japan and possibly Australia under the Malabar exercise and strategic diplomatic cooperation at the quadrilateral grouping definitely brings in its own set of benefits for India. India's involvement with the Quad and India's elevation of the Malabar exercise into a quadrilateral naval exercise will definitely help India build a strategic alliance or a strategic coalition against the aggression and assertiveness that China has displayed across the Indo-Pacific region, including in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and more importantly in the Indian Ocean region. Such a strategic coalition will provide India with a leverage while dealing with its border disputes with China. It will also help India to access latest defense technology, especially naval technology, from the United States and Japan. It will help India gain access to anti-submarine warfare technology such as anti-submarine aircrafts, anti-submarine missiles, etc. It will also help India to gain access to aircraft carrier construction technology, naval fighter jets, etc. But more importantly, India is very eager to strengthen its submarine fleet in order to establish a stronger deterrence against the increasing presence of Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean region. But however, these benefits come along with its own set of costs and consequences, that might negatively affect India's interests in the region. See, the ongoing border tensions between India and China is still in the process of being resolved, and both the sides are yet to completely disengage from the positions that they had held at the Galwan River Valley. At a time when the disengagement process is going on, if India decides to include Australia under the Malabar exercise, China might misinterpret India's intentions, and this could possibly lead to increased Chinese aggression along India's borders. Then, as India seeks to build a strategic coalition with United States, Japan and Australia, which are principally opposed to China, China would also definitely strengthen its nexus with other hostile countries such as Pakistan. A stronger China-Pakistan coalition can create numerous problems for Indian interests, and it could raise several more challenges to India's strategic and national security interests. If India presses ahead with such a strategic coalition, then China would also seek to enhance its influence and presence in India's neighboring countries such as Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and as well as across the Indian Ocean region, stretching all the way from Eastern Africa to Southeast Asia. So enhanced Chinese nexus with Pakistan and enhanced Chinese presence in India's neighborhood could pose a direct threat to India's strategic interests in the region and as well as to its national security. So the writer is asking India to be cautious before seeking such a strategic coalition under the Quad, because along with its benefits, India will have to be prepared for its consequences as well. See, before expanding the Malabar naval exercise into a quadrilateral naval exercise involving Australia, the writer is asking India to first evaluate the strategic rationale behind the quadrilateral grouping. See, key members of the Quad, such as US and Japan, have made it clear that the Quad is not just a strategic diplomatic grouping, but it would also be a military grouping. This is because the primary intention of the United States, Japan and Australia is to bring together like-minded democratic powers of the Indo-Pacific region and establish a maritime coalition against China. Through such a coalition, these countries are hoping to enforce a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region, with the primary objective of countering China's aggression in the Pacific, especially in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So it is this part of the Indo-Pacific region that these three countries are really focused upon, and the Indian Ocean region, which is a priority to India, acquires a lower significance under the Quad. Yes, of course, Australia is concerned about developments in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, but it alone does not have the capability to assist India in countering the Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean region. See, the United States in particular is entirely focused upon the Pacific region, and this explains its active naval deployment, especially in the South China Sea, in order to counter the latest round of aggression shown by the Chinese Navy. As far as the Indian Ocean region is concerned, the American involvement is limited to military exercises, and neither the US is interested nor does it have the operational capability to actively deploy into the IOR region. So if any clashes were to break out between India and China in the IOR region, it is hard to expect either the US or Japan to come to India's assistance because of their operational constraints. Then moreover, India should also realize that China has not actively threatened any of India's interests in the IOR region. Yes, definitely China has increased its naval presence. It has built a string of strategic relations around India and has invested heavily in a series of strategic projects across the IOR region. But the aggression shown by the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea has not been witnessed in the Indian Ocean region. The Chinese naval ships and its submarines have never openly threatened any of India's vessels, and they have not disrupted the freedom of navigation in the IOR region. Then India should also keep in mind that despite the close defense and strategic partnership with the United States, American defense manufacturers are still hesitant to share anti-submarine warfare technology with India. Yes, India has procured the P-8I Poseidon aircraft from US, which is known for its anti-submarine warfare capabilities. But American defense manufacturers are only interested in selling this technology to India, but they are not interested in transfer of technology. They are not interested in making India a joint partner with regard to the development of anti-submarine warfare technology and also with regard to the construction of aircraft carriers. So American manufacturers and even the US government, they are looking for a buyer-seller relationship with regard to such critical naval technologies, but they are not seeking a joint partnership. So by keeping all these factors in mind, and by keeping the cost-benefit analysis in mind, the writer is asking India to make a conscious decision whether to elevate the trilateral Malabar naval exercise into a quadrilateral naval exercise involving Australia. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 in which the writer, Mr. R.K. Vij, who happens to be a senior IPS officer belonging to the Chhattisgarh State Police, evaluates whether we need a separate law to deal with custodial torture. See, the demand for a separate anti-torture law has been gaining ground over the last few weeks in the backdrop of several incidents of police excesses that have been reported across the country. First, we witnessed the custodial torture and custodial death of a father and son in Tamil Nadu. Then recently we witnessed a questionable encounter of a gangster in Uttar Pradesh. In the backdrop of these incidents of alleged police excesses, the demand for a separate anti-torture law has been growing, but the writer argues that there is no need for a separate anti-torture law because according to him, the need of the hour is to implement the existing recommendations of various commissions which could plug the gaps in the existing legal system in order to hold the police accountable for any incidents of custodial torture and custodial deaths. So while evaluating why a separate anti-torture law is not needed, the writer examines some of the existing provisions. First, he points out that under the Indian Penal Code, custodial torture has not been defined. But the IPC does deal with hurt and grievous hurt, and this covers any physical harm that might be caused by the police against the accused. While physical torture is partially covered under the IPC, it completely excludes mental torture and mental trauma. So the failure of the Indian Penal Code to define torture and include mental torture highlights its shortcomings. Then upon this, the writer points out that the provisions of the IPC that seek to hold the police accountable for causing any physical harm to the accused is not strictly enforced. So the writer says that these shortcomings of the Indian Penal Code has to be fixed first, and the existing provisions have to be enforced strictly before we seek for a separate anti-torture legislation. Then the writer talks about the Criminal Procedure Code or the Code of Criminal Procedure. Under the CRPC, it has been mandated that every case of custodial death has to be inquired into by a judicial magistrate. This provision has been provided under the CRPC in order to ensure the independence of the inquiry and ensure that the police are held accountable for being responsible for any custodial deaths. Even though the CRPC provides for this provision, and even though judicial inquiries are ordered into each case of custodial death, the very low levels of prosecution does not instill any confidence in the independence of such investigation. Then the writer talks about how various judgments of the Supreme Court and the High Courts have expanded the definition of torture, and even though the law just covers physical torture, the judgments of the court has expanded the definition of torture to include psychic torture, coercion, intimidation, etc. For example, in the landmark D.K. Basu case, the Supreme Court laid out the jurisprudence on custodial torture. In fact, the entire jurisprudence, that is the entire judicial philosophy on custodial torture, evolved through the D.K. Basu case. Then in the Neelabati Behera case, the court had held that the state cannot escape its liability in case of custodial deaths and custodial torture, and the state is liable to pay compensation to the victims. Then the writer also talks about the guidelines of the National Human Rights Commission, which has made it mandatory to hold autopsy on camera for every case of custodial death. This guideline of the NHRC helps in ensuring that the police cannot interfere with forensic evidence. But on the ground, these guidelines of the NHRC and these directions of the courts are never strictly enforced, and as a result, the police are never held accountable for their excesses. So in this context, the writer argues that what we need is not a separate anti-torture legislation, but an urgent implementation of the existing recommendations that have been provided by various committees in order to strengthen the legal and judicial system against torture. The writer even carries out a careful examination of the draft Prevention of Torture Bill that was tabled by the government in 2017. After a careful analysis, he labels the bill as vague, harsh and retributive in nature, which if implemented could inhibit the police forces from carrying out their functions. The writer points out that under the draft bill, the definition of torture and police excesses is very vague, which leaves a lot of scope for misuse and abuse that could end up unfairly targeting the police forces. Then the writer also points out how the harsh provisions of the draft law can inhibit the functioning of the police forces. For example, the draft law had mandated that every complaint of custodial torture and custodial death should be treated as an FIR, and it denied anticipatory bail, thereby creating an opportunity for vested interests and political forces to misuse these provisions and unfairly target and persecute the police forces. Then the writer also criticizes the draft bill for seeking retributive justice instead of promoting reformative justice, which is the norm in any liberal progressive democracy. The writer says that the draft bill promoted retributive justice because it contained the provision of death penalty. The writer points out that when developed and progressive countries are moving towards the abolition of death penalty from their law books, India is still trying to retain death penalty even in the newer laws that have been proposed. The writer argues that these harsh and retributive provisions that were a part of the draft Prevention of Torture Bill of 2017 would only end up in instilling the fear of prosecution in the minds of police officers, and thus it would inhibit their effective functioning. The writer says that the fear of misuse of these provisions and the fear of facing these harsh penalties would inhibit even honest police officers from effectively exercising their duties. Then the writer even makes a reference to India's hesitation to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture. See, even though India has signed the convention, it is yet to ratify this UN convention. In previous sessions, we have discussed as to why India is hesitant to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture. India fears that if it ratifies the UN Convention Against Torture, then its security forces could be unfairly targeted by hostile countries, and such a possibility is quite higher because Indian security forces are dealing with multiple national security challenges, including terrorism, insurgency and militancy across the central parts of India, the northeast of India, and as well as in Jammu and Kashmir. So if India ratifies the convention, then countries that are hostile towards India, they might bring up fake charges against Indian security forces on geopolitical grounds, and India fears that this would not only become a restriction on the security forces, but it could also have the potential to affect India's global image. But however, the 273rd Law Commission had recommended to the government to ratify the UN Convention in order to fulfill India's basic commitment to human rights and international law. As of 2017, the Indian government was still considering this recommendation, and it is yet to ratify the UN Convention. So the writer says that the time has come for India to consider the implementation of such recommendations in order to help bring India in line with global standards as far as holding the police and the security forces accountable for their excesses are concerned. So after pointing out these flaws and discrepancies in the existing laws and provisions, the writer says that there is no need for a separate anti-torture law. Instead, what we need is an urgent implementation of the existing recommendations of various committees that could help in addressing the root cause of the problem. The writer says that if the existing recommendations are implemented, then it would result in wide-sweeping police reforms and judicial reforms that could help strengthen the legal and judicial system to effectively hold the police and security forces accountable for their acts of excesses and violence. The writer says that police reforms should focus on improving their training in order to make the police a more humane and ethical force, and also to enable them to rely more upon scientific investigation instead of relying upon third-degree methods such as torture. Then along with this, urgent judicial and legal reforms are needed in order to plug the gaps and shortcomings in the existing laws and in order to make them more effective. But along with police and judicial reforms, what we need is a strict enforcement of the existing laws and provisions so that swift punishment can be dealt out to the guilty police officers. And according to the writer, this is how the police forces should be held accountable under existing laws and provisions for their acts of excesses and violence. Next, on page number 9, we have an article according to which China has crossed its 1960 claims along the line of actual control. This article relies upon historical official records and satellite images to prove that China has enhanced its claims along the line of actual control, especially along the Galwan River Valley and the Panong So Lake. But since we have already held an elaborate discussion on this topic over the last 1.5 months, we shall not be discussing this article, but I would request you to go through this article once. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. As the United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary, it has come out with a final draft declaration that calls for a softer approach on UN reforms. The call for a softer approach on UN reforms is being seen as a dilution of the earlier commitments that the permanent 5 countries had made to promote UN reforms, and a dilution of India's long-standing demand to reform the UN and its institutions. See, India and a few other like-minded countries have long held that the UN and its organs are outdated and they are just a relic of the World War era. According to India and these like-minded countries, the UN in its current format does not reflect the current geopolitical realities. So for this reason, India has been pushing for broad reforms at the UN since the 1990s. And for this purpose, it has even formed an informal grouping known as the G4, which includes India, Germany, Japan and Brazil, which also have similar demands. Recently, we even spoke about Prime Minister Modi's call for reformed multilateralism while he was addressing the Economic and Social Council, which happens to be one of the principal organs of the UN. See, after years of effort since the 1990s, India and a few other countries had managed to push the United Nations to adopt a resolution in 2008 that stated that the United Nations has decided to push for UN reforms and promote intergovernment talks in order to provide for equitable representation for other emerging powers and push for the expansion of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council, which is currently limited to an exclusive club of 5 countries. But contrary to the word decided, which was used in the 2008 resolution, the final draft of the latest declaration says that the UN members will take up discussions in order to consider reforms of the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council and the Economic and Social Council. So the replacement of the word decided with discussions is seen as a dilution of the earlier commitments that the P5 countries had made. And this softer approach of the UN on structural reforms could also dilute India's long-standing demand. This softer approach seen in the final draft declaration is also seen as a dilution of the 2005 resolution of the United Nations. In this resolution, the UN members, especially the P5, they had supported UN reforms and an expansion of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council in the backdrop of the unilateral decisions taken by UN members, which led to the invasion of Iraq by the United States and its allies without obtaining the required sanction of the UN. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Rhinos have very poor eyesight, but they make up for it with their superior olfactory and auditory senses. More than 55% of the world's one-horned rhinoceros population can be found in the Kaziranga National Park alone. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. See, there are 5 species of rhinoceros in the world. This includes the white rhinoceros, the black rhinoceros, the Indian rhinoceros, the Javan rhinoceros and the Sumatran rhinoceros. Amongst these, the white and the black rhinoceros are native to Africa, whereas the Javan and the Sumatran rhinoceros can be found in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Whereas the Indian rhinoceros, also known as the greater one-horned rhinoceros or the great Indian rhinoceros, is native to the Indian subcontinent, and nearly 55% of the world's one-horned rhinoceros population can be found in the Kaziranga National Park of Assam. Then for the sake of prelims, please take a note of the IUCN status of these different species of rhinos as well. The black rhinoceros of Africa has been listed as critically endangered. The white rhinoceros has been listed as near threatened, but its subspecies, the northern white rhinoceros, has been listed as critically endangered. The other subspecies of the white rhinoceros, that is the southern white rhinoceros, has been listed as near threatened because they are present in large numbers. Whereas there are only 2 female individuals of the northern white rhinoceros that are alive in the world, and recently the last male northern white rhinoceros died in Kenya. Then the Javan and Sumatran rhinoceros of Indonesia have been listed as critically endangered, and the Indian rhinoceros has been listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 1 which refers to the threat faced by the one-horned rhinoceros in the Kaziranga National Park during the flooding season. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following border management challenges are currently being faced by India along its borders with Bangladesh? Illegal migration, pumping in of FICNs or fake Indian currency notes, cattle smuggling, drugs and human trafficking, maritime boundary dispute. See, the question is asking the current border management challenges that India faces with Bangladesh. So the correct answer would be option C, 1, 2, 3 and 4 only. See, India and Bangladesh share both a land border and a maritime border. With regard to the maritime border, there are no major border management issues, and the minor boundary dispute that existed was resolved in 2014 itself in a peaceful manner with the intervention of the Permanent Court of Arbitration as per the provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the land border between India and Bangladesh is extremely challenging with regard to border management, and please note that India shares its longest land border with Bangladesh. Managing this long border becomes all the more challenging because of its porous nature, which is a result of the riverine network that is found along the India-Bangladesh border. The Ganga, the Brahmaputra and their tributaries that flow from India into Bangladesh create a vast riverine network along the border that ends up posing logistical challenges for the designated border guarding force, that is the BSF. Under the One Border, One Force policy of the Ministry of Home Affairs, it is the BSF which has been designated to guard India's borders with Bangladesh. And the BSF has to deal with numerous border management challenges, including illegal migration, trafficking of drugs, weapons, human beings, pumping in of fake Indian currency notes, infiltration of terrorists, and as well as cattle smuggling. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, 3 Bangladeshi nationals have been lynched in Assam for cattle smuggling. Now let's take up the next practice question. Uyghurs are recognized as native to the Xinjiang province of China. Option C is the right answer. See, Uyghurs are an ethnic Muslim minority found in the northwestern province of China, that is the Xinjiang province. This minority ethnic group has always felt oppressed and persecuted at the hands of communist China, and as a result, a few Uyghurs have fallen prey to extremism and radicalism in their attempt to establish the Xinjiang province and few parts of Central Asia as an independent country known as Turkestan. For this purpose, a few radicalized Uyghurs have even set up a terrorist outfit known as the ETIM or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. But to curb these separatist activities and to tackle extremism and radicalism amongst Uyghurs, China has set up a number of controversial facilities in the Xinjiang province that it refers to as re-education camps. According to reports of Western governments, Western media and Western intelligence agencies, lakhs of Uyghurs have been forcefully taken to these re-education camps by the Chinese security forces, and in the name of promoting de-radicalization, their human rights are being constantly violated. There have been reports of torture and coercion against the Uyghurs, and apparently they have even been forced by the Chinese state to abandon their religious practices by forcefully exposing them to alcohol, smoking, and other prohibited practices in Islam. Western governments have even referred to these re-education camps as torture camps, and this ongoing persecution of the Uyghurs and the violation of their human rights has even been labelled as a cultural and religious genocide. In the light of these allegations, the US government has started imposing a set of sanctions against the Chinese government and against its officials, and now Britain seems to be following in the footsteps of the United States, and this has invited an angry response from the Chinese government. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Rashtriya Garima Abhiyan is a national campaign to eradicate the practice of manual scavenging and rehabilitate the manual scavengers. Option C is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: India's plan for naval coalition building alone will not credibly deter China's military power in the Indian Ocean. Critically analyze. The second question: considering the increasing incidence of police excesses, there is an urgent need to implement an anti-torture law as per the existing recommendations of various commissions. evaluate? Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. I hope this has been a useful session, and do let us know your feedback in the comment section. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.